Welcome to this service of Evensong at Great St. Mary's. My name is Yüce Kabakci. I'm a first-year ordinand at Westcott House. We're glad that you're with us as we look at this wonderful story told by St. Luke in his Gospel. So, only a fool or a drunkard would attempt to sail in a stormy weather, said the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. And I sometimes wonder which one is more terrifying, the absence of God or the presence of God. I think the answer depends on where we are in life in relation to where we assume God is. Throughout the scriptures, we see examples of both his presence and his absence, and they seem to be more disturbing than comforting. When God withdraws his presence, we hear songs of lamentations. When God reveals himself, we see people shivering in fear. But Luke's story that we have just read today interestingly contains both at the same time. In the Hebrew scriptures, God's protection is usually predicated on the phrase that God does not sleep. However, what we read today, what's happening in that passage is that this does not only seem contradictory to disciples' understanding of God's protection, but also his wisdom. The text says that Jesus fell asleep before the storm came. So he might have been a careless sailor, but fishing was the main profession of the disciples. They knew when not to sail. Again, the text doesn't say this, but it was possible that when Jesus asked them to get into a boat and go across to the other side, some of them might have looked at each other with puzzled faces and said, "Oh boy, something's going to happen and it won't be pleasant." So as the clouds started gathering over the boat, you could hear them reciting Psalm 121. "I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." But pointing to Jesus, Peter might have turned around and said, "Well, except for this one." They all see that he's actually slumbering and sleeping. From their experience up to this point, Jesus had seemed to be a wise man, but now Philo seems to be right. He must be quite intoxicated to sleep through a storm on a small boat. And in our experience, we all know that sense of helplessness when someone we rely on is nowhere to be found. So the problem for the disciples is not necessarily the storm itself. They've seen many of them. But their problem is why Jesus is absent in the midst of their crisis. So when we read this passage, the usual interpretation seems to be that Jesus chastises his disciples for panicking. But I don't think we should jump to the end of the story that quick. We might have heard before that faith is something that you need to muster to make good things happen in your life. If you can only believe that God will do such and such, then you will get it. It's as though God is waiting to push a button in heaven, but he wants to see if you truly believe that he can do it. But I'm not convinced that that's how faith works. Because let's assume for a moment that the story went into the opposite direction. That is, the disciples had that kind of faith. If that were true, the question is, would it have prevented the storm? If we subscribe to that kind of understanding of faith that I just talked about, the whole point of the story seems to be Jesus trying to show them how powerful he is, or that the cause of their fear and panic was their faithlessness. But I don't think that's the point of the story. Because interestingly, when we look at the wording of Luke, who's usually very careful about his grammar, when Jesus speaks to his disciples, it lacks the auxiliary verb. It lacks that helping verb. The text does not say, "Where was your faith?" Nor does it say, "Where is your faith?" It says, "Where? Your faith." So you're left hanging in the air, trying to determine the timing of the verb. You're left with no concrete answer as to the timing of that lack of faith, because the text actually reads, "Where? Your faith?" or "Your faith? Where?" Well, you can say, well, obviously he meant to say, "Where is your faith?" But I believe Jesus' concern was not that they could have stopped the storm or prevented it happening in the first place if they had faith. And if I'm brutally honest, as I've thought about this passage over and over again, I am reasonably convinced that Jesus' sleep was not so heavy to the point of not noticing that the boat was about to sink. His aim was to teach them that his faith in his Father is what enabled him to continue to sleep in the middle of a storm. So this episode is not about how Jesus chastised his disciples for being afraid of the storm, but rather for failing to understand why he was so comfortable sleeping. So this story is not about the magical properties of faith that you can somehow create within yourself to change your circumstances. Because the storms of life are real. And if we don't feel like our boats are about to sink from time to time, it's not because we have faith, but because we may lack just basic self-awareness. Jesus himself did feel the sinking of the boat, but his own trust in God was what he wanted his disciples to see and have. I believe that's why he said, or Luke wrote, "Where? Your faith." That is, your trust. Where? So as we're going through these challenging times of a pandemic, some of us can rightly feel the same panic. Not to feel that panic or discomfort would be unhealthy. Our boats have been filling with water, but God seems to be sleeping. But that sleep is not a sign of his absence, because this putative absence is not a sign of his apathy. So the challenge of Jesus for us today is to trust in the fact that he cares, he loves, and he acts. He will rebuke the wind and the raging waves of our troubles, and there will be a calm. Amen.